Hello and welcome to our What's New in IC 2019 webinar. My name is Jen Malone. I'm one of Lloyd's Register's IC product champions and I'll be your host for today. For those of you that are aware, IC 2019 is now available for download and was released a couple of weeks ago. And the purpose of this webinar today is to allow you to get ahead of the curve, to show you some of the new features that are available within IC 2019, to talk about some of the general improvements that have been made to the software, and also to talk about IC 2019 Update 1 and what will be coming soon within the software as well. Unfortunately, we will not be able to take live questions at the end of the webinar, but please ask questions either through our GoToWebinar portal or via our digital products email address, which is now showing on the screen. Any questions that are sent through either of these options will be responded to directly as soon as possible. IC 2019 New Additions. There are several new key features that are available within IC 2019, including our project and wells permissions, our new DLIS Loader, our array data visualization within IC, and new functionality surrounding our stratigraphic ties. I'll be speaking to you in detail and demonstrating how each of these new features work throughout the course of this webinar. The first feature to discuss and to look into is our new project and wells permissions. These changes to the way that our user roles work allow you to hide projects, wells, and data types using user roles, assign different roles to different users, which then allows customized access to multi-user databases, and either hide all projects or wells or show all projects or wells as the default. So it allows database administrators far more control over which users can see which data, which wells, or even which projects. I'll show you how that works by jumping into IC now. Within IC, users have access to a number of different wells with different data within them, all sitting within a number of different projects, like so. Up until now, data administrators have had no way of controlling which users have access to these projects or even the wells within them, which when you're working in large teams can be problematic. If you're working on projects or with multiple teams that all have access to the same database, sometimes you may want to restrict who can work within a particular well or even within a particular project within the database. And that's what we've tried to do with IC 2019. So the new features for project and well permissions are centered around the database ribbon, users and roles security area. So if I come into the user manager here, you might notice a few differences with the ordering and setup and a few new tabs as well. So if I was setting up a new user, the first thing I would do is I would assign them a username. I would assign which privileges they have, so whether they can edit wells, create new wells, maintain dictionaries, etc. Then I will actually want to configure from the highest level down whether they have access to particular projects, particular wells, or even the data within the wells. So you've been able to control the data within the wells for a number of years, either using user roles on the data level for your discrete data, curve sets, and interpretations as well. But you've never been able to control which wells particular users have access to, or the projects either. And that's what we've done here. So you may notice that the configuration for project and wells is very similar to that of the data for the discrete data. So we've used the same kind of functionality for that purpose. We've used what we call user roles within IC to help data administrators configure that control. So how do they do that? Well, let's pop into my wells to start with and come to my manage roles. And I've already got one set up here. Let's have a look at the configuration for it. So the first thing you'll notice is you obviously have to give the wells a name, but that you have the database level with all of the wells underneath it. One of the key differences that we have between the project and wells roles and the data roles is that it's limited to, you can either see the data, so you have read and write access to the data, or you can't see the data, it is hidden data. We don't have a read-only option at this time. It may be something we think of in the future. But for the current functionality, you can have two defaults. So the first default would be that you have access to all of the wells within the database. You can then come in and restrict a couple of those wells, like so. The other default is that you have no access to any other wells within the database, but you can have access to a few wells, like so. So you configure this access level. You then can apply it to users. So from this wells role window, I can then apply that to multiple users at once. I can then swap that back and forward as appropriate and necessary, like so. So I'm just going to cancel that because I liked my settings for that one. You can also, on an individual basis, come in, so I'm in admin, and I can come to my user roles and I can look at the available roles present, and I can apply that to my user, like so. So I can see that I've got access to these wells here. Actually, let's give me a little bit more access. I think I'll need it for a little bit later on. So let's give me a little access to some of these wells. And there, you can see the changes have taken straight away, like that. Okay, right, so that's wells. So at the project level, it's fairly similar. I can take an existing role and I can apply that to my projects. So typically, you would have a data administrator logged in like I've been doing here. They would set up your new users, they would go through the privileges, access, apply all the project roles, etc. When that new user then opens the database, they will then only see the data, the wells, the projects that they have access to. That's fantastic for new projects, I hear you say. But what about existing data? How do those changes affect existing charts, existing projects, etc.? Well, I'll show you. So I've applied those changes to myself. So instead of logging out and then logging back in again, what I can do is I can refresh those changes. And you can see here, I now only have access to 3 different projects. If I click on the faults project, I don't have access to any of the wells within this project. So it's popped up a little note to tell me that. So the window then says this project contains wells that you do not have access to, which may prevent other project resources from being displayed. So that extends to things like maps, charts, etc., where the well may be present, but because you don't have access to the well, it's not going to show you anything. So that's kind of keeps your pre-existing charts, maps, etc., secure from any users that don't now have access to those wells. So if I come over to my Scarpa wells where I have access and go to a chart, so I've got a few charts here. So this chart will open because I have access to that well like so. But if I then try and open the correlation, which has all of the Scarpa wells within them, it tells me that this chart references 1 or more wells that I do not have access to and cannot be opened. And similarly, if I try and open one of the maps, it won't let me open that map either. So your pre-existing data is secure. The second new feature within IC 2019 that I wanted to speak to you about today is the IC DLIS Loader. So previous versions of IC haven't been able to take files from DLIS, array data, etc. But within IC 2019, that's changed. So IC is now capable of storing, managing, and displaying array data. And as part of that project, we built a IC DLIS loader so that users can independently and directly load data directly into IC. So this enables people to load both regular and irregular curves. They can manage your curve data alongside data from LAS, ASCII, Excel files, etc. It's very similar to the IP DLIS loader in that it's very easy to use. And it also enables users to create and match curves on the fly as well. So leading on from that, once your data is loaded into IC, either via the new DLIS loader or using the IP-IC common database or the IP direct link with IC, you would then want to visualize that data. So we've included a new composite data type for visualization where you can select either the gradient, the waveform, or a stacked visualization, enabling you to show live linked FMI data, NMR data, waveform data, etc., allowing users to have that extra complexity, extra dimension to their interpretation alongside their other IC data. There are two ways of accessing the DLIS loader within IC 2019. The first is via the Import-Export ribbon. Coming to the logs, there's a new DLIS option available here. I would simply browse to the particular file I was interested in, open like so, and run through the process. The second option for loading data is actually just to drag and drop that DLIS file directly onto the IC canvas, where it then populates with the information required. The first thing to do is actually to come and select which well you wish to load the data to. The IC DLIS Loader is currently a single well DLIS loader, so you will only be able to load one well from one DLIS file at a time. Looking at the data itself, I can see that I've got multiple DLIS frames available. I can swap and change between the two like so. I could have many more down the left-hand side here. So I need to decide which data I'm actually going to load. So if I come over here and pick this one, it's fine. I then need to select which curves I want to load. So I have all the curve names available from the DLIS file here. I also have a description of each of those files in the middle here, as well as their top and base depths and units. Within this file, I can see that I only have one dimension curves, but if I had array curves, I could have 1 to 60, 12 to 240. I could have a variety of dimensions available. So to begin matching where I want my data to load to within IC, the first thing I need to do is actually select which curves I wish to load. So I can manually tick some of those on, or I can click load at the top here and that selects all. I then would want to pick a curve set. It automatically selects the default. I could come in, double click and change that default. Alternatively, if I want the same curve set for all of my data within my file, I can select a curve set from the bottom here. So let's just choose that, like so. The final part of this is I want to match my data. So I can see that some of these have matched, some of them haven't. So looking at the file name, these items are then matching within curve names that are existing within IC at the moment. If, however, I wanted to change this, I can double click on a curve, I can come in, I can create a new curve, change that name perhaps, and then match that with that. If I had a number of no match data types, curve types to match to, what I can do instead of having to go into each one separately and either create a curve or match manually, I can use the create and matched curves option down at the bottom here. So what that's going to do is if I click that, I then need to pick a group to match to, and it's going to create those three curve types. So it's just matched directly from the name within the file and created those curves within IC. Coming back to what we mentioned earlier about the DLIS frames, you can in fact create curve sets for each of those frames using the final option at the bottom here. So once I'm happy with that, I'm only loading 6 curves out of the 10 available. I can press import, and that will tell me that those 6 curves are now imported into IC. So if I close this window, what can I do with that data once it's loaded? So if I'd loaded some regular data, some regular curving data within IC, I could come to my files, double click there, and I can actually go and have a look at that data using the normal browser. With DLIS data, of course, you can bring across array data as part of that process, and visualizing that within IC is slightly different from normal curve data. So if I come over to the left here, I can see that I've got some curves which have these brackets and the numbers after them. So these indicate that these particular curves are in fact array curves and have different dimensions to them. So if I come to my CMR curve up at the top here, when I click on that curve to visualize it, the first thing I see is I've only actually got one track. It's telling me that I should have 30 arrays within that curve, but I'm only seeing one at the moment. And the reason that is because IC is only displaying the average of those arrays in a single curve. To expand that curve out to see the full array, we have an option at the top within the View ribbon of the log browser. If I click Expand Array Data, that then shows me each one of those 30 arrays that make up that curve, like so. Because IC isn't an image analysis tool, it is not a curve analysis tool either, you cannot edit the array curves within IC. So coming out of the log browser, so one of the other areas, and probably the most important one that you would want to use array data within IC, is actually the visualization. So coming to a chart that I made earlier, we can see that I've got just a normal well stick here, and I want to add some array data to add complexity to my interpretation. So coming to the top here, I'm going to insert another data panel. And this time, instead of just selecting a normal curve, I'm actually going to select a composite type for my plot. So you'll notice that there is a new array log option. So I'm just going to click that there. That then automatically brings up the array log panel properties window, where you can start to customize the visualization of that data. So you can then select the curve type, obviously, and then the style that you want to visualize it in. I can fit my data to my curves, change the height, give it a cutoff, and even customize the colors that I used. So my window decided to walk away, like so. I can add other visualization for array data within my IC well stick as well. So if I right click here and insert another panel and come to composite again, I can then choose a different type of curve type. So this time what I'm choosing is a finalized FMI array curve. So this has been analyzed and interpreted within a petrophysics package. This one in particular was analysed within our sister product IP. The final curve from that analysis has been created, and that's what I'm going to display on my track within IC. Now you can display the individual paths, the unanalyzed raw data as well, but the finalized image file gives a much nicer finish and display, especially on an IC track. So if I select that there, I'm then going to choose the gradient option for the style. I can then pick my gradient. So if I come into here, you can manually decide your color ranges. So I could do something, my color option has gone AWOL again, from like yellow up to a, let's go with a red, for example, something like that. Or I could use one of the predefined palettes. So you can also load IP palettes within this option as well. So you would then browse for that file and load that as appropriate. Or you can use one of the predefined IC palettes as so, like that. I then want to fit my curve values, so 0 to 255 here, but I could change that manually as well. So I'm just going to press OK and OK again, and it's loading. And you can see there that's now loaded my array data. Now this is effectively live data within the database, which means it's not an image file that has been given a top depth and a base depth. This is actually data, so if I go straight to viewing that data, that then brings up my log browser, which again I could expand and visualize that way. Now, of course, one of the powerful parts of IC is its capability of showing your well sticks, not just individually, but also as part of a wider correlation. So I'm going to show you one I made earlier. And you can see how adding that additional array data visualization to your correlation can add that extra complexity to your interpretation. Array data is not just able to be visualized within a log browser or on a chart. You can also utilize, there we go, IC's querying capabilities by using your maps. So here's one I made earlier. So I have a map here with my wells. I'm aware that some of these wells have array data within them. So I'm going to create a query to locate that. So IC queries, if I come to my well data, one of the new general improvements that we've made to IC queries is that you don't necessarily need to just select the group or the type anymore. You can also select the set as well. But in this instance, all my data is within my default, so that's fine. So what I might want to do is identify which wells have my FMI data within them. So I can go to data logged. I can then say OK, and I can pick a shape. I'm actually happy with my yellow circle there, and OK. Drag and drop that onto there, and you can see how the IC well queries are also utilizing that array data, so you can interrogate your database to identify where there is array data and even for which intervals it's present as well, adding it to the overall capability of the IC well queries. Other areas within IC where array data is picked up includes the utilities and the reports. Now, the whole expanded array is not reported on, so you can't pick out a particular curve within an array that contains values between a certain amount. But what IC will do is it will use the average of that array, use a singular curve, and give you the values for that instead. So, within IC 2019, we've also included the ability to create automatic SQL Server databases. In previous versions of IC, you've had access to Access databases, Oracle databases, SQL Server databases, etc. IC 2019 is the first version where you have two options for your database style, either SQL Server or SQL Local Database. So we've started to streamline the process of creating your databases now as part of that, and users now have the ability to create the new database name directly within the IC interface instead of having to go to the management studio first and create it there. And I'll show you how easy that is to do in a moment. A few minutes ago, I mentioned that we'd made some improvements to the array data to allow array data within IC. And as part of that, we did add a component and we did do some work to the IP-IC common database as well. So not only will the IP-IC link recognize array data and allow you to synchronize that between the two softwares, we also made some improvements around the maintaining of well header information between both applications. Using IC's well management tools, for example, to bulk update the IP coordinate systems, give the wells X1, Y data, and then synchronize that between the two applications as well. We've also added things like a new progress window for the synchronization, which is particularly useful if you have very large IP databases that you're synchronizing with IC for the first time, as this can take some time, and it's good to have a progress window to let you know how that's going. Within the IP to IC common database, one of the improvements that we've made is around the creation of that common database. Now, previously within IP, if you started within IP, you would come to the Advanced Interpretation tab, you would click on IC Correlation and Mapping, and IC would work in the background to create all of the new tables within the IP database folder structure, meaning that you had a multi-user IP database and a single standalone user IC database. You would then need to attach that database to a SQL server to make it a complete multi-user database. Now we've streamlined that whole process, meaning that you can now create SQL Server IC databases within the IP interface. So if I come here and click on Correlation and Mapping, it now brings up the familiar IC New Database window. Now it's automatically chosen local DB as it is the default, given it a database name, and already pre-selected the IP database folder. To create a SQL Server database, I click on SQL Server. I then populate the data. So it's already giving me the data files folder. That's the IP folder, so I want to keep that the same. That's where I want to build my IC database structure. Up here, I'm now going to populate my SQL Server information. So this is a server that I have admin access to, where I can read and write and where I can be an owner of particular databases. Okay, I'm now going to give the database a name. So this could be IPIC _ test. Now you'll notice I was very careful not to leave any spaces within the database name. SQL Server databases can be quite sensitive to that, so please remember not to leave spaces within the database names. Underscores are perfectly fine. So once I'm happy with that, I can then press Create Database. I'm going to use my SQL Server Integrated Security, but if I had a username and password set up as part of my login to the server, I would use that instead. So IC is now going to connect to the SQL Server and see whether it has a database by that name set up, ready to populate. No, it doesn't. This is a new database I'm creating. No such database currently exists on the server. Would I like to create a new database? Yes, I would, thank you. So that's now going to work in the background and create that new database for me. Now this is also streamlined from previous versions of IC, where you would have had to go to your SQL Server, you would have had to set up a, I'm just going to click on that there. While that's working in the background, you would have had to set up a database ready to be populated. You'd have then had to come back to IP. You would have had to fill in the data that you'd already populated just there. You'd have had to make sure that the database name within the SQL Server matched up to what you've put within the new creation window. So we've streamlined that whole process now that you can do that within the new database window, and that will then go through. So we can see that IPIC has now got to the point where I can now configure my workflow, and I would then just take it through the normal steps as you would previously. to set up your database. So you can see I now have my opened IC database. I've got my blue cat wells within IC and IP there as well. So I'm actually going to close my wells within IP for the next bit of this demonstration. So I'm just going to very quickly close those wells. No, thank you. Okay, so let's jump back to IC. So within IC, I can come to my wells and I can look at the well header information. So I can see that from IP, IC has picked up the longitude and the latitude and the geodatum, but there was no grid system set and there's no surface X and Y. So what I can do within IC is I can actually change that. So I can see here that I don't have a grid system that I'm happy with. So what I can do is come to my coordinate manager system. I can pick an ED50 like so, add it to my drop-down list. I can then come back in here and that's now available for selection. What this now means is that I can use the data from here and the grid system information to generate my X and Y from my longitude and latitude. If I'm happy with that result, I can press yes. So that's now populated that information. Okay, so I'm going to close that. If I come back to the database, I can now synchronize that data back to IP. So when I come back to my IP database and go to the same well and load that well, I can now come to that well header information, go to my position, and I can see that data has updated. The final new feature that I wanted to speak to you about today is our improvements to using stratigraphic data effectively. So we now have a feature which enables you to ignore qualifiers when you're tying on charts. It's part of our ties manager options. This is available within automatic ties, ties manager, and when you're creating manual ties as well. And it allows you to add things, what we call qualifiers, stratigraphic qualifiers, or uncertainty to your data. So, for example, you may have some data that is questionable. You would put a symbol like a question mark in front of the term, which is fine for a single well, but when you're tying in a correlation, being able to tie that automatically can speed up your interpretation considerably. The use of stratigraphic qualifiers on charts when tying your data has been added to IC 2019 and is used as following. So stratigraphic qualified data, if I come into the formation here to show you, is when you're not certain about a particular term or a particular unit or a particular interpretation. So you might add a qualifier to that data. So this could be a question mark at the beginning, a question mark either side of the term, or even two question marks, etc. It could be a symbol effectively to show a level of uncertainty for that particular data. That then, once it's displayed on a chart, shows the same as the other units that are more qualified. So if I zoom in on this particular unit, a little bit closer, you can see that this data, although it has a qualifier at the beginning of the flamingo, it's showing in the same dictionary colours as the flamingo to the left and the flamingo to the right. Now this is all controlled via the data manager using the stratigraphic data tick box here, or also if your data type is included within a strat scheme which is active within the project. Now there are some default stratigraphic qualifiers which are used within IC. Typically the question mark is the most common one, but you could use other symbols as well. We've also included the ability to customize the symbols that you use by coming to your database folder, support, opening the qualifiers using Notepad, and you can see here that each qualifier should be a single character on a new line. At the moment, question mark, speech marks, and the small squiggle are also interpreted as qualifiers. I can add a new line and I can add maybe a double question mark as my new qualifier. So IC will pick that up as a level of uncertainty. I just save that. And the next time I restart IC, it'll pick up that additional information from the .dat file, and it will use a double question mark as part of my interpretation. So that's great for single wells. I'm looking at my chart stick and my well sticks individually, but what about actually tying that data? So that's what I'm going to do now. So if I come to my ties manager, I can see that just looking straight here, I've got my flamingo units here, but I've also got this qualified flamingo here that is counted as a separate unit. So if I just tied normally like so and zoomed out, you'll be able to see that this unit, which is qualified, is being ignored from the main correlation. At this scale, it's not too bad. I can see that the unit kind of looks the same, but if it was a much smaller unit or if it was a much larger correlation, I'd have lost that detail of the interpretation. So what we've done within IC 2019 is it enabled you to actually ignore those qualified units and include that unit within the rest of your interpretation. So if I now retie the correlation with ignore qualifier switched on, like so, you'll be able to see that that unit is now included within the rest of the interpretation. This functionality is not just within automatic ties within the ties manager. You can also, by having ignore qualifiers ticked on within the ties manager, use the same functionality within manual ties. And you can also, within the correlation wizard, when building your automatic ties, tick on the option to ignore qualifiers. Section 2, General Improvements. So along with the big new features that we've put into IC 2019 that I've just spoken to you about, we've also put in a number of general improvements and bug fixes to the software. And that's what I'll be spending the next few moments talking to you about. We've added new functionality to the well queries to enable different curve sets to be selected along with the specific curves within the well query. So instead of just selecting the group level, you can now select the set level as well. We've made improvements to our map scaling. You can now use symbol scale factors such as 0.1 to help scale your maps to give you more accurate positions for your wells. Users should now be able to see improvements to the speed and functionality within these large correlations when working with array visualization, spectral fill visualization, etc. Improvements have been made to the log scripter to allow IC to handle null values for you. Previous versions of IC forced the user to write the handling of null values into the script itself. For a lot of users who aren't very good with scripting, this was something that they're not familiar with. So when they run the script, you might have had null values popping up where they shouldn't be. So the new functionality enables the user to tick the box displayed, and that will treat the null value as a negative 999.25 as a null and not a number. Now, of course, you can sometimes get negative 999.25 as a number within the scripts that you may be running, so that option is flexible. These are not all of the new features which have been included to IC 2019 General Improvements. We have a new MSI installer as part of the installation package. The package can be downloaded from the website and more details are within the release notes. Improvements have also been made to the way that IC works within Windows 10 high resolution displays. So any users who are experiencing difficulties when they were using multiple screens or very high resolution screens should see improvements with AppGrad. We've also made improvements to things like the well path data conversion for fixed depth steps. Interactive chart editing and visualization improvements have been made, particularly for point symbol and point sample data. Improvements have been made to the unit manager. We've also resolved a few issues such as with picks and tops when printing to PDF, and increased the maximum number of letters that could be used in various areas throughout the software. Section 3, IC 2019 Update 1. So I've just finished talking to you about all the exciting features which are now out within IC 2019, but we're already looking ahead to what could be within IC 2019 Update 1. We're still working on that, of course, but I can tell you that we're including improvements around our exporting of Spotfire data. We've made some improvements to how Stratabugs data can be imported into IC, and also the connection to some of the new Stratabugs database types as well. And we're continuing to make improvements to that interactive editing on charts. This is one of the core functionalities within IC, so we're spending quite a bit of time to make sure that we can make the improvements needed as they're being reported by our customers, by you guys. So that covers what I wanted to speak to you about today. We've covered the new additions within IC 2019, some of the general improvements that you will see throughout the new software, what will be coming soon within IC 2019 Update 1. Thank you very much for your attention. Please let us know if you have any questions or if there's anything else that we can help you with. And I hope you enjoy the software.